2 years ago, my buddy and I decided to do a late fall backpacking trip up around Mount Rainier. If you've ever been to the Pacific Northwest, you know how fast the weather can turn from a crisp, sunny autumn afternoon into a deadly, freezing nightmare in a matter of minutes. I'm Leo, and my friend Ethan and I honestly thought we were completely ready for the rugged, unforgiving terrain of Washington State. But absolutely nothing could prepare our minds for the crushing isolation of those dense, rain-soaked forests. Mount Rainier itself is a massive, snow-capped active volcano, a beautiful but notoriously deadly giant surrounded by endless miles of ancient temperate rainforest, where the freezing fog rolls in like a thick, suffocating wall. The surrounding area is deeply infamous in American lore as the absolute capital for bizarre, unexplained disappearances, a real-life twilight zone where experienced hikers frequently vanish without a single trace into the deep, dark timber. We were miles away from any form of civilization on a lesser-known, poorly marked trail when the sky suddenly turned an ominous, bruised purple, and a violent, freezing mountain storm slammed directly into us with blinding sleet and howling, deafening winds. Hypothermia was becoming a very real, life-threatening danger, and our visibility was reduced to mere feet as we stumbled blindly through the towering trees, utterly desperate for any kind of physical shelter before the temperature plummeted well below freezing, just as pure, unadulterated panic was truly setting into our chests. My trembling flashlight beam caught the stark, comforting outline of a small wooden park ranger cabin nestled deep within a dense thicket of pine. It looked exactly like a standard National Park Service outpost, a welcome, God-sent sanctuary from the unforgiving elements. So we lunged toward the heavy wooden structure, completely unaware of the horrifying psychological trap we were walking straight into. The heavy door gave way with a loud, echoing groan, slamming shut violently behind us against the raging gale and instantly cutting off the absolute worst of the mountain storm's freezing fury. Inside, everything appeared perfectly ordinary and deeply comforting at a first glance, looking exactly like the standard rustic ranger stations scattered across the Pacific Northwest wilderness. A sturdy, dust-covered wooden desk sat directly in the center of the room, flanked by an old-fashioned green metal filing cabinet and a pair of worn canvas cots pushed tightly against the rough log walls. However, the comforting illusion of safety shattered into a million pieces the exact moment the heavy, dead silence of the cabin was punctured by a sudden, jarring burst of sound. The old emergency radio console sitting on the desk crackled to life completely on its own, broadcasting a horrifying, repetitive loop of heavy, distorted static, laced with the distinct, agonizing sound of a grown man weeping in absolute, frantic terror. As Ethan tried in vain to aggressively turn the analog dial or find a power switch to cut the feed, I stepped closer to the desk and noticed an open logbook, its yellowed pages brittle with age. My blood ran completely cold as my eyes locked onto the final entry, penned in shaky, desperate handwriting and dated exactly 40 years ago to the very day. The chilling message offered no comfort, providing only a stark, desperate warning to anyone unfortunate enough to seek refuge within these walls. God help us, it changed the coordinates again. Do not trust the shelter. If you are reading this, lock the door. Do not look at the windows, and pray it doesn't realize you're inside. Ethan let out a forced, incredibly nervous laugh, his voice trembling uncontrollably in the quiet room as he desperately suggested it was just some elaborate, sick prank left behind by twisted local tricksters or previous hikers who merely wanted to mess with people's heads. But the sheer, suffocating weight of the atmosphere in that cramped room made it absolutely impossible to dismiss the icy dread settling deep into my chest, especially when my eyes began to register the subtle, deeply disturbing physical anomalies of the structure itself. I walked across the creaking floorboards over to the small, square window to peer out into the raging mountain storm, but the glass didn't show the dark, swaying forest or the white streaks of falling sleet. Instead, it reflected a pitch-black, entirely unnatural void that seemed to press heavily and aggressively against the pane. When I tentatively reached out and rubbed the thick layer of dust off the cold surface, I realized with a sudden, violent jolt of pure adrenaline that the window wasn't glass at all, but rather a solid, meticulously painted piece of wood, cleverly disguised to look like a glass frame from a distance. Fear spiked sharply through my entire body as I spun around to tell Ethan about the discovery, only to notice with absolute horror that the room felt significantly smaller than it had just 5 minutes ago. The heavy log walls seemed to have actively shifted inward by a few noticeable inches, the space between the center desk and the cots compressing subtly but surely, narrowing the physical layout of the cabin in a terrifying way that utterly defied every known law of geometry and human architecture. To make matters worse, the weeping on the radio loop grew louder, shifting from a distant, muffled sob to a desperate, breathless hyperventilation that sounded like it was coming from someone hiding right under the floorboards directly beneath our boots. I grabbed Ethan hard by the front of his jacket, pulling him violently away from the blaring radio console, frantically pointing out how the heavy ceiling beams were now low enough that he actually had to duck his head to avoid hitting the rough-hewn timber. The trapped air grew thick, hot, and difficult to breathe, smelling faintly of old copper coins and stagnant ancient mud. A foul scent that instantly triggered an instinctual, primal fight-or-flight response deep within the oldest parts of our human brains. Ethan finally stopped trying to aggressively fix the radio, his face turning a sickly, pale white in the dim light as he pointed a shaking finger toward the heavy front door we had entered through just a short time before. The heavy iron latch, the metallic handle, and the deadbolt were completely and utterly gone, replaced instead by a perfectly smooth, unbroken expanse of solid wood that showed absolutely no sign of a seam, a handle, or hinges. We were completely sealed inside an enclosed structure that was actively changing its physical shape around us, adapting and closing in like a wooden throat, preparing to swallow us whole. Every single corner of the room seemed to warp and bend slightly whenever we blinked our eyes, the straight lines of the walls warping into subtle, unnatural curves that made our heads swim with a sickening, disorienting sense of vertigo. The realization hit us both with the force of an actual physical blow. This wasn't a standard national park ranger station built by human hands, but a predatory sentient anomaly disguised as a sanctuary, designed specifically to lure in desperate freezing hikers. The agonizing weeping on the radio suddenly cut out, completely replaced by a low, rhythmic, and deeply unsettling scratching sound that vibrated directly through the solid log walls of the cabin, sounding exactly as if hundreds of long, sharp fingernails were dragging slowly across the exterior wood. Ethan and I immediately backed into the absolute geometric center of the shrinking room, pressing our shoulders tightly together as we stared in unadulterated horror at the walls, watching the solid timber begin to warp, flex, and bulge weirdly inward toward us. It looked as though something incredibly massive, heavy, and formless was pressing its weight against the outside of the cabin, methodically testing the structural strength of the wood, trying to find a weak point to break through and reach us. Suddenly, the external scratching stopped entirely, and a new voice drifted out from the dusty radio speakers. But it wasn't the weeping man anymore. It was my own distinct voice, clear as day, playing back an exact conversation I had with Ethan hours ago on the trail. The audio loop perfectly captured the precise moment we had panicked about the incoming storm, our recorded voices sounding fragile, distant, and terrified, repeating the exact phrase, "We need to find shelter right now," over and over again in a grotesque, mocking cadence. Then, the playback voice distorted horribly, stretching out into a low, rumbling, inhuman register that didn't sound remotely natural, vibrating the very floorboards beneath our boots with a sickening frequency. The cabin walls groaned under the immense external pressure, the dry wood splintering slightly as the heavy ceiling dropped another few inches, forcing both of us to drop down onto our hands and knees in the rapidly compressing space. As we crouched desperately on the dusty floor, the green metal filing cabinet next to the wooden desk suddenly began to rattle violently, its heavy drawers sliding open and slamming shut on their own tracks in a chaotic, frantic rhythm. Dozens of old, yellowed missing person flyers from the past 4 decades spilled out in a messy cascade onto the floor, each one featuring a faded photograph of a smiling hiker who had historically vanished without a single trace in the vast Mount Rainier wilderness. I gasped for air as I crawled closer to look at the papers scattered around my knees, instantly recognizing the specific names of local people from famous cold cases that regional true crime lore and pop culture often associated with bizarre wilderness anomalies. But what truly paralyzed me with a profound, soul-crushing terror was the very last flyer that slid slowly out from the bottom drawer, looking crisp, clean, and brand new compared to the decayed papers around it. It featured a crystal-clear, high-resolution photograph of Ethan and me, taken from directly behind while we were hiking earlier that afternoon, complete with our full names, our correct ages, and the current date printed meticulously across the top. Directly below our printed faces, the bold black text didn't read "missing" or "search party," but instead held a single, chilling, and definitive word that confirmed our worst fears about our ultimate fate: consumed. Without warning, the radio exploded into a deafening, high-decibel wall of white noise, and the floorboards beneath us tilted violently at an angle, threatening to slide our bodies into the pitch-black, stretching corners of the room. The thick wooden floorboards beneath our trembling knees began to separate with a horrific tearing sound, pulling apart like rows of ancient teeth, opening up a wide, bottomless mouth that exposed a freezing, pitch-black void hidden directly beneath the cabin structure. A piercingly cold wind, smelling strongly of ancient volcanic ash, sulfur, and decaying pine needles, blasted violently upward from the dark abyss, carrying with it the faint, echoing screams of dozens of distinct, agonizing human voices. Ethan completely lost his footing as a massive, gaping chink opened directly underneath his body, his legs dangling helplessly into the empty, whistling darkness as he desperately clung to the smooth edge of the heavy wooden desk with white-knuckled grip. I lunged forward across the shifting floor, grabbing his wrists with all the remaining physical strength I had left, my boots slipping and sliding on the dusty, tilting planks as the cabin continued to violently compress, warp, and distort around us. The walls were so close now that they were actively pressing hard against the frame of my heavy nylon backpack, the solid log construction feeling strangely warm and rhythmically pulsing, mimicking the slow, steady heartbeat of a massive subterranean living organism. Directly above us, the ancient ceiling beams cracked with the sound of breaking bones, weeping a thick, sticky sap that looked and smelled unmistakably like dark human blood, dripping down in heavy drops onto our wet clothes and faces. The old emergency radio console on the desk was now shrieking a continuous high-pitched broadcast tone that drilled directly into our skulls, blinding us with sharp physical pain as we frantically fought to survive. I pulled upward with absolutely everything I had left in me, my muscles burning with a terrible exhaustion as I dragged Ethan back up onto the remaining sliver of the tilting floor, both of us gasping for air in the suffocating, increasingly claustrophobic space. Looking down into the pitch-black abyss between the separated floorboards, my eyes caught a faint, pale luminescence shifting in the deep, revealing a massive, undulating mass of tangled winter clothes, weathered hiking gear, and old, shattered human bones. It was a literal physical graveyard of everyone who had ever stepped through that false cabin door over the past 40 years, permanently trapped inside the stomach of a regional anomaly that fed entirely on human desperation. Ethan screamed a raw, blood-curdling sound as a pale, horribly decayed arm suddenly reached up from the darkness of the pit, its elongated fingers wrapping tightly around his boot ankle, trying to drag him down into the collective mass below. I reached out, grabbed the heavy, iron-bound logbook from the edge of the desk, and slammed it down onto the grasping arm with all my might. The impact releasing a sickening crunch and a cloud of freezing, foul-smelling dust. The pale arm retreated instantly back into the dark void, but the entire cabin gave another massive, violent shudder, the walls closing in so tightly that we were forced into a tight fetal position, completely pinned against the pulsing wood. In a final, absolutely desperate act of survival, Ethan remembered the small steel survival hatchet, tightly strapped to the outer side of his internal backpacking frame, tearing it loose with a frantic, trembling hand, just as the heavy timber ceiling pressed directly against our bent backs. He began hacking wildly and repeatedly at the pulsing, bleeding wood of the back wall, each heavy strike releasing a loud, piercing, and agonizing shriek that echoed directly from the blown-out radio speakers sitting on the desk. The entire cabin seemed to violently convulse in genuine physical pain, the floor planks bucking like a wild animal as Ethan finally broke through the thick outer layer of organic wood, revealing a blinding, chaotic flash of the real, freezing mountain storm raging outside. I immediately joined in the effort, kicking furiously at the splintered, widening opening with the heels of my heavy leather hiking boots, completely ignoring the dark, thick fluid that sprayed heavily over our clothes as the living structure fought to keep us contained. With one final, coordinated, and desperate push, we threw our bodies through the jagged hole, tumbling out into the freezing mud and blinding sleet of the real Mount Rainier forest ecosystem, gasping for precious cold air as we rolled uncontrollably down a steep, rocky embankment. We didn't stop running for hours, completely ignoring the freezing storm, the pitch darkness, and our own extreme physical exhaustion, until we finally stumbled onto a main paved mountain road and flagged down a passing, brightly lit National Park Service vehicle. The real National Park Rangers were deeply disturbed by our frantic physical state and injuries. But when we later tried to guide them back to the exact coordinates of the structure, we found absolutely nothing but an empty, completely undisturbed clearing of ancient old-growth pine. The Rangers somberly told us that no official cabin had ever existed in that specific remote sector of the park, eyeing our ruined, bloody clothes and severe physiological shock with a mix of professional skepticism and quiet, knowing wilderness dread. It's been 2 long years since that horrific autumn night, but the deep psychological scars have completely and utterly ruined any sense of peace or safety I ever had in my life. I moved entirely away from the Pacific Northwest, trying to escape the memories, but the horror followed me across the country. Every single time a sudden thunderstorm hits my new suburban home, I can hear a distinct, low static buzzing echoing from the drywall of my bedroom. Sometimes, when the heavy house settles in the dead of night, the bedroom walls seem to press inward just a fraction of an inch, and I can hear Ethan's familiar voice whispering from the metal heating vents, begging me to turn off the radio. I know with absolute certainty that the false cabin didn't just let us go out of weakness. It marked our souls, and it's slowly redrawing its geographic coordinates right now, waiting for the perfect storm to pull us back into the dark timber for good.